Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We move on to the next two speakers. These are short talks. The first one is given by Deepak Nair, who is a new faculty in the Center for Neuroscience at the IISc. Deepak did his doctoral studies in the Leibniz Institute of Neurobiology in Germany and did a postdoctoral stint in the Interdisciplinary Institute of Neuroscience in Bordeaux in France, and then joined the institute as an assistant professor a year back. And he's going to, his general interests have been in the lab to study organization and dynamics of key synaptic molecules using a variety of interdisciplinary approaches. And one of the main things that he has started doing in the Center for Neuroscience is to develop cutting-edge microscopy and optogenetic tools to observe synapses at the nanoscale in real time. Deepak?
I'm really thankful to Professor Rao for this kind introduction, and I'm also equally grateful to the organizers, especially Vijay, for giving me a chance to present this work in this nice audience. I have to confess that this work is still in infancy, but I really feel that there is no better audience that I can present this work to start off. So, over the last 2 days of intense talks that we have, it's very well like we know what happens in the pathology of different neurodegenerative diseases, which includes both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And it's very clear that one of the major things leading up to Alzheimer's disease is the proteolytic processing of amyloid precursor protein. So what's known is that there is a non-amyloidogenic pathway and there is an amyloidogenic pathway, and like certain risk factors or mutations push this to take amyloidogenic pathway, which is basically identified to be because of reduced clearance of A-beta or an increased expression of A-beta oligomers at the synapses. Despite the fact that like several decades or more than a decade and a half work in biochemistry and molecular biology, we know that there are several biochemical pathways involved in the generation or involved in this process, but very little is known about the mechanistics of how APP is recruited or regulated at the membrane of synapses. So which basically comes down to this one, that you have synapses and APP is known to be present in both pre and postsynaptic sites. And we know that there are several pathways. There is endo and exocytosis, which regulates the number and position of receptors in the synapses. Also, it's not very clear yet whether there is a role of lateral diffusion in organizing this one. But still, what's not clear are that what are those factors which really regulate this APP levels at the synapses. So if there is any role in the regulation of APP at the synapses at all, that's what I wanted to address. So, but we are having a fundamental problem over here, that the functional domains in the synapses are like much smaller. Like say, there is a postsynaptic zone, for example, is like around few hundred nanometers in radius, while there is a perisynaptic zone where the proteins are stay in the reserve pool. This also in a very small, like say, in few hundred nanometers in diameter, which is much below the limit of light resolution of the light microscope. However, we can use electron microscope, but it does not give us an idea about what really happens in life. So one of the initial studies on APP organization of the synapse had come from the group of Silvio Isoli, which this was the cover of the Science last 2014 May, where we tried to characterize several proteins in the presynapse and identified that there are a lot of APP molecules organized in the, this is a presynaptic, this is synaptosome and this is presynaptic part, and you can see these pink dots are APP molecules and they are organized in the surface of this one. You can see that around 1% of the total protein population in the presynapse is around APP, and you can also see that there are around 7,000 molecules, which translates to a very high molarity of around 30 micromoles. But what's not clear is that whether this such presence of large concentration of APP in the synaptic neuron, what is the functional implication is still very unclear. And it's also unclear that what is the organization of APP at the postsynapse. That's where we wanted to start off. So this is a conventional microscope imaging of APP and PS95, which is a postsynaptic marker. We can see that there is localization. We can see very high extent, up to 40 to 50% localization of the synapse between APP and PS95. But what's not clear is that this localization, this resolution is not really enough to understand the understand the localization between different functional domains in the synapse. So we had to rely on high-end super resolution microscopy to go and understand this localization. So super resolution microscopy works it's very simple in this way. You have a bulk fluorescent image which is made up of like thousands of fluorescent molecules. So what we try to do is that we try to make this, somehow we convert this fluorescence into very sparse subsets of fluorescence from single molecules. You see that the molecules are switched on one by one, and then we try to calculate the center of each of this localization and try to reconstruct this position. And when we do this over and over time for a large set of molecules over here, we finally create a better image over here, which has a much better resolution than the original one. So how does it happen in a real system is like this. So you have a diffraction limited image, that's a conventional microscopy image. You start generating like random single molecule fluorescence in this space and then reconstructing live and get a final image of the object here, which is way better than the original one. So now just applying this into the real systems. So here we have a conventional image. And now what we try to do is that we convert this to a single molecule ranges. So you can see that isolated single molecules of microtubule getting fluoresced, and then we reconstruct at the real time, and what really ends up is an image with a better resolution. So in this case it increases the resolution by around 10 to 15 fold, and you can see like isolated microtubules dangling across different regions in the cell. Now the question is that can we apply this to understand the localization of APP at the synapse? And this is an immunocytochemical image of an APP, and here APP has been stained at the C-terminus, and we can see that this is a dendritic shaft of a pyramidal neuron, and now when we do the super resolution image, the picture completely changes, and you can see that it's not very homogeneous anymore, but we have a heterogeneous pattern which is really very, very punctate. Now let's have a very closer look at this thing. You can see that this is a dendritic shaft, and we can see these clusters are both in the dendritic shaft as well as you can see in some of them in spines too, and it's not yet quantified fully, but those clusters what we see inside this dendritic shaft are much more intense. Inside the spines are much more intense than that we see in the dendritic shaft, indicating there is a much larger number of molecules organized into these clusters at the spines. Now let's look what happens if we are trying to see the resolution of this when we try to do it with a postsynaptic marker. In this case, the red staining is the APP, and the green is the PS95, which is a postsynaptic marker. So all these puntas that you see, these yellow puntas that you see, are the sites where there was an active synapse. And now we go for a closer look. We can see that the thing changes again, and we see that it's a very different kind of localization. And let's have a closer look at the synapse again. This is an epifluorescence image where you see these puntas or synapses, and this is the dendritic body. And now you see it's a very stochastic localization that you see between these two proteins. You can see that some cases they localize very well. So we wanted to go in and understand what really happens within the synapses. So this is an example of it. This is a synapse by a conventional imaging paradigm. You don't see anything, you see only blurred fluorescence all over. Now when we look at the epifluorescence super resolution imaging, you can see that it's very clear now. So this is organized into, like the PST is organized into discrete clusters, so is the APP. And when we try to analyze what happens is that we try to get two populations of synapses. One where the APP is localized right into the postsynaptic density, and in some other cases you see that it is to the periphery, and this is also evident in the line scan. It's around 100-200 nanometers from the center of the postsynaptic density. So this tells you that there are, first, the APP is organized in discrete clusters. Second, that it is localized stochastically in the synapses, that in some cases it is right onto the postsynaptic density, and in some other cases it is right at the perisynaptic region. These functional implications are not clear, and mostly the sizes of these domains are only few tens of nanometers. Now the question was that, are these domains functional? So if these are functional, there has got to be some exchanges of APP molecules from inside these domains to that of outside. And now that's what we do. So we initially wanted to characterize. I'll just walk you through what we want to do. So first we took a membrane marker, which is a transmembrane, single transmembrane protein, and we attached the photoconvertible molecule EOS. And this is the epifluorescence image. What we are interested in is that how what is the kind of movement on the plasma membrane. So we took the total internal reflection fluorescence, where this is the thing which is this is the membrane patch, which is extremely close to that of the membrane, and so you can see the colocalization. You can see the central part, which is of the same cell, which is touching the cover glass. And now what we try to do is that, so what we try to do, we try to photoconvert them at a very low signal, and now you see this is, you can see it kind of looks like a Bangalore traffic, where you see the chaos all around, where you see the molecules moving around in all directions, because it's live cells, live cell and live molecule, and we can reconstruct all the positions to create a kind of super resolution image. And adding to that, we also get not only the nanoscale position, but also the mobility of each individual molecules that has been once detected. Now, though it is as chaotic as Bangalore traffic, we have mathematical ways to calculate the movement or the parameters which is involved in this kind of movements. For example, this is a trajectory. So if you are able to calculate the mean square distance between every consecutive points, and we plot the first curve, and let's say we do it for the subsequent, and we get the second, and do it till the third, and do till the curve finishes, and we get a curve known as the mean square diffusion curve. And now there are different kinds of mean square diffusion curve. If it is linear, it means unhindered Brownian diffusion. If it is upwards, it goes like a directed movement, and if it is downwards, it means confined. That means it is somehow it is stopped. There is a traffic jam. So now we try to look at individual trajectories. We have now thousands and thousands of trajectories. So we have we can really go and look at individual properties of any APP molecules that was once detected. So in this case, like say, or any molecules, it can be APP, or in this case the membrane markers. For example, in this case we see three different kinds of movement. For example, green is something which is immobilized, that means which is really stuck. And let's say white is a confined one, and let's say the red is something which is freely moving or diffuse, like active transport, which is also bending slightly upwards. So we can see different kinds of movements. Then we can try to understand the slope of this. And since we have thousands and thousands of molecules, we can try to get a histogram of this localization and understand what fraction of the molecules are moving fast to what fraction of molecules are moving slow. Now, we try to apply this to understand the difference between two APP variants. One, a wild type which is not known to cause any disease, and the next one is an APP Swedish, which is a double mutation right above this plasma membrane, and which creates which shifts the balance towards the amyloidogenic pathway. So we track we put the EOS molecule here, and this is what we get. So you can see that, you can see that there are clusters in both cases, and in case of APP Swedish, which is a mutation, you can see there are more of these clusters. And not only that, in all these clusters, you can see that there are molecules moving in and out of these clusters, So we try to understand what is the mechanism. So we saw that, like say, for example, the membrane marker, which is more or less almost 80% of this, is shifted towards the fast trafficking. And in case of APP wild type, it is also similar. But in the case of APP Swedish, you can see that the membrane diffusion, as lateral diffusion on the membrane, is shifted towards the left. This is indicating that it is indicating more confined movement on the plasma membrane. Now we try to understand let's say, the median diffusion, which is also indicated. So the APP the mobility is pretty high. And the pre-display or the membrane marker, the mobility is very high, and let's say if you come to the APP wild type, it is lower, and in the case of APP Swedish, it is much lower, indicating much stronger confinement. And we try to average all these 10,000 or let's say trajectories that we get, and we see this indicative average behavior of all the molecules that we already observed. In this case, you see this is the pre-display, almost follows the unhindered Brownian diffusion, while both the APP Swedish and wild type follow confined, but the confinement of APP Swedish is much more than that we see with the APP wild type. Now, what do we learn with all this? We see that there are APP clusters which are, let's say, nanoscale clusters on the plasma membrane. So onto the top of that, there are a certain number of APP molecules organized into this one, and it is a functional cluster because there is an exchange of APP molecules into and out of these clusters, and then not only endocytosis and exocytosis control the membrane population, but there is also this lateral diffusion on the membrane which affects the APP trafficking and the properties of APP. And now anything that we do on the APP, like all those, like say in this case we took APP Swedish, which is involved in the familial mutation, familial SMS or genetic case, and we saw that it was the mobility, lateral diffusion and the clustering of this was affected. And probably I cannot conclude, let's say, anything on the disease list, but at least it brings forward a very interesting mechanism that this takes the step further before the pre-proteolytic cleaving stage, where probably the aggregation, clustering and trafficking properties of this protein may say something about the biophysical or biochemical mechanism which is leading up to the process of whether it has to go for AD or non-AD pathways. And last but not least, this is my group, and I am extremely thankful to my colleagues Naren, Balaji and Vijay for helping a lot in setting up the lab as well as free use of resources. Thanks to Ajit and Devjyoti, our constant source of help and support for cloning and immunocytochemistry, both are from Vijay's lab. And most of this work was done by one of the very talented doctoral students from my group, like say Shekhar, and he's like third in this group, and he's also presenting a poster over here. So if anybody has more things, you can visit the poster. And last but not least, thank you for your attention.
Because we have one more talk before the coffee break. Somebody is dying to ask a question. None?
We move on to the last speaker before the coffee session, and that is Balaji Jaiprakash, who also is a new faculty member at the Center for Neuroscience. Was done a master's in chemistry, PhD in chemistry from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, and then went on to do a postdoctoral stint at the Weill Medical College of Cornell University in New York, and was in the Department of Neurobiology later on at the UCLA in Los Angeles before he came back to this country and joined as an assistant professor in the Center for Neuroscience. Balaji, again, is a chemist, and his research lab, in his lab, largely focuses on the understanding and establishing neuronal correlates of remote memory and its role in creative problem solving. And I've got his title now correctly, so I can tell you that he's going to speak on dendritic spine dynamics in young mice models of Alzheimer's disease. Biology. Okay. 12 minutes.
Thank you, Dean, for a very generous introduction, and thanks very much for the opportunity to present before this audience. While Karthik is our lab, as Dean pointed out, is interested in understanding the symmetric and cellular basis of remote memory. This one. And recently we have been interested in understanding this aspect of remote memory in AD, and particularly in AD mice. So, what is remote memory? Thanks to several different animation studies and the recent studies from several different animals, we have this wonderful little model of classifying the memory, wherein we say that long-term memory is classified, could be classified into declarative and non-declarative part, and of the class of specific interest today is this declarative part, which are defined as memories that one can consciously recollect. These are the memories that you say, okay, where did I park my car today, before I come in, and things like that. And these memories are in general classified into facts and events, and events are one's lifetime events, and the facts are general facts, worldly facts that you extract from the events that happen in your life, and also you learn from your experiences. So this memory, the event memory that happened in your life history, over a period of time becomes independent of the region, the medial temporal lobe, where it actually is initially formed. When it becomes, it acquires a character where you can actually retrieve these memories independent of the medial temporal lobe, you call that as a remote memory, right? So, of a particular interest to us today is autobiographical memories, say memories of the type, say the answers to what was your first job and the earliest birthday that you can remember. Now, while many of us would be able to recollect these things very nicely, but you will realize the vividness with which you recollect these memories are very different. In the sense, when you have a recent memory, you remember it to the point where you know what dress you wore for your first job to what time you landed in, and so on and so forth. However, in due course of time is not that rich anymore, and in fact you can actually measure this, as it was done in this study, where they measured the autobiographical memory through a list of questionnaire and asked and arrive at a score. The score here corresponds to the richness to which you can actually remember the details. They did it in two different groups. One group were patients with the dementia of Alzheimer's type, the other is age-matched control. So what they did is that they took 60 to 70-year-old people, and then they posed these questions pertaining to their life events and public events that had occurred in different periods of their life, 40 to the period where they have been the study, minus 2 years, and 16 to 40 and 0 to 15. Now, as you can see that in this older group of people, you have a reasonably good extent of remembering these events, and they are very good in remembering things that had happened little earlier, in their kind of middle ages, right, 16 to 40. I think that's the kind of the prime time of your human life, so it's not a surprise that you tend to remember a lot of things with a very rich content. However, what I want you to pay attention to is this group. You can see these are the dementia of Alzheimer's type patients. They are in general able to retrieve lesser amount of these details, but more importantly, what you see is that there is a significant difference between the extent that they could remember and retrieve the richness in their own life, the events that had happened in their earlier life compared to the recent past. Okay, that's very significant, and suggesting that it's not that you are not able to retrieve. There's something around here. This is roughly the time period where they started to set in the dementia too. So it's not that they are not able to retrieve these older memories, but it's somehow they're selectively unable to encode as well as retrieve the memories of just the recent past. Alright? In this context, we wanted to ask, could this be because there is a selective synaptic loss in neurons participating in memory trees, particularly remote memory trees? If that is so, what aspect of the memory retrieval do they manifest? Okay? So, in order to address these questions, our strategy, we wanted to do it in mice for reasons that will become apparent in a little bit. The strategy we adopted is to generate a transgenic, triple transgenic technically, wherein a double transgenic APP-PS1 mice is crossed with a Taiwan GFP transgenic mice. So this, by now many of you would have realized that it's the mouse model for ED, while this is a mice that is expressing fluorescent protein GFP in a stochastic manner in excitatory neurons. Okay? The idea here is that if you do generate this transgenic mice expressing GFP in APP and PS1 together, what we will be able to see is to be able to see the expression of the GFP in these APP-PS1 mice, and then ask these spine related questions. And by the way, this work is predominantly done by Shanko and Suraj. And what they do is first to take the static picture of this mice brain, and clearly you can see fantastic fluorescent neurons in the cortex as well as in hippocampus, with actually can zoom in with a very high resolution where you can see the putative synapses, we call it the dendritic spines, and to the extent actually you can start counting them. This is just a preliminary thing to see if there is any obvious differences, and they did it in about 4-month-old animals, and what they see is roughly there is a difference in CA1, but there is you have to look at the apical dendrites and so on. However, the difference is not so significant in the cortical region, though because of different reason. Our primary aim of the study is not to just look at the static picture of the spines, but instead what we wanted to ask is what happens to these spines as two things. One, the mice ages, and second, when the mice learns a new task. By the way, this a similar study is in a much more elaborate and detailed manner is carried out in Vijay's lab by Sunny, and you can, if you're interested, please you should check with the posters in a 1-month-old, and they do see this hippocampal difference, but not so much in the cortical regions. They were looking at anterior cortex, but we are looking at retrospinal, but despite that, that's that's where it stands. So why do we want to see these spines as a function of time when they age, or as a function of tasks that they learn? One is that in this study, the Trachtenberg study, where they took a similar mice and they were actually asking these questions in barrel cortex following experience-dependent plasticity, cortical plasticity. And what you can see is that even though these different lines represent different neurons in the brain, and even though they have pretty much a steady density of spines over different days, this goes short time, but still we are in this different days. However, if you actually look at their dynamics meaning, let's take a spine, let's mark a particular spine. Now that we have a resolution to actually spatially locate that spine, we can actually follow that spine in time, and if you do that, you can actually see in different neurons and ask the fraction which of the spines actually carry forward till all the 8 days, and you see that there is a general exponential decay of the spines. That's the lifetime of the spines, but there are two classes of spines which are which are having a very different dynamics. One, very rapidly turning over spines, they live for about a day or so, but the other actually stay even after 8 days, much above the exponential prediction that you would have had from this 2 to 8 day fit that you study. So now, in this context, actually what we wanted to do is then be able to follow the spines in vivo, and our lab is specialized in developing these neuromicroscopy systems. And in short, what's happening here is that a wide variety of little optical setups, each of them catered towards addressing a specific issue, all are ending up in our ability to enhance the depth of imaging, and as you will see, a wider field of imaging too. Now, with this setup, what we did was, of course, to characterize the resolution and all that stuff, and then actually, we can take the pictures of the mice in vivo, and yes, please. And when you do that, yes. When you do that, what you do see is that this is one of the various different slices that we are going through from the cortical brain, and you can clearly see the dendrites with a resolution good enough to see the spines. And what is of interest to note here is that scale bar represents about 10 microns. So that's about 10 pixels. And if you actually look at here, from here to here, it's about 3,500 pixels. Now, that, if you actually calculate, is about 1.5 millimeters, and that is still only 1/4 of the cropped image that I'm having. So, in essence, you can actually image all the way from gamma to lambda in a mice brain, with a resolution where actually you can zoom in and actually see this individual spines. Alright? Now, that's still in vivo, but it's still a single snapshot. What I promised you is that we will follow it in time. Okay? So, and we did that, and the idea being that we'll take the 2-month-old mice, do the training, which we haven't done it yet, but we'll do the training, and after 24 hours, we'll do the testing and image and both these plot places, and wait for about 30 days, which is the time it takes for the mice to form the remote memory, and again image there, and those are the very same regions. Again, I'm just cropping out the region here to a small portion here to show the same dendrites that we are actually following. It's very compressed image. Again, we can actually zoom in and then see the fantastic dendritic arbor as well as the spines in here. Since I have told you that it's a very large field of view and a lot of spines and a lot of dendrites are there, identifying, classifying and counting manually is a tedious job. Okay? So what Sewage found out was that this, the GFP, the fluorophore, when it is present in the putative spines or the synapses, should have a different local environment compared to spines or the synapses which are not stable or not or the fluorophore present in a dendrite or a cell soma. If that is so, we should be able to actually measure that and be able to use it as a marker for identifying different classes of spines. So how do you do that? So in short, whenever you have a molecule and you are trying to excite the molecule, what you are doing is that you are taking a fraction of the molecule that is present in the ground state to the excited state, and then in the excited state the molecule lives there for some period of time before it relaxes back. Now you can work out the dynamics of this. When you do work out the dynamics of this, and then it turns out that the local environment reporters are the fraction of the molecules that are getting excited and the lifetime, so to speak, the time that the molecule spends in the excited state. Both of them can be measured quantitatively by doing a very simple intensity scan. So you take a region of region of interest and then do a repeat few intensity scans, and then actually you measure the fluorescence in these images, and this is like, you can do it in a pixel wise or a region of interest wise, whichever way you like it, and the degree to which it's deviating from the linearity. Okay, it should be linear because it's power square, it's 2 photons, so, but the degree to which it's deviating from the linearity gives you a measure of the local environment, and when you do measure this local environment, you can actually see that the first step is that it's very different in a spine and the soma, and more interestingly, this is, by the way, a small fragment, actually reconstructed in a 3D. And you can clearly see the spines here. And the first thing is to see, can we actually classify, is the local environment different in these spines? And the answer is big yes. And you see the dots here are the different intensity points, on the same spine. And these are the standard deviation of the distribution. There are many distributions here, like each point has its own distribution, and you can clearly see both of them. There are two different groups that are segregating here, and if you do that, in this particular, using this curve, in this particular image, you can actually classify these guys are different from the other two, the other group. Through this, we hope that we will be able to process we'll be able to set up a workflow and then process the entire images where we can actually identify and follow the dynamics of these two different classes, and maybe even the dynamic spines can be identified even earlier in time. So what next? What we actually want to do is, as you can see, as I stated in the initial question, is we want to do this as a function of, all that I have showed is that as just a function of time, right? We wanted to do it as a function of neural activity, or particularly memory formation. The way forward for that is we will generate these mice. We're still at this stage, and we want to, we have viral vectors that express fluorescent markers specifically in plasticity participating neurons and memory trace, so-called memory trace neurons, and we will take this and generate our experimental animals and perform this study. With that, I would like to thank the people. This is my lab, and it's been wonderful to be in a department where it's absolutely collegial and it's just wonderful. And my special thanks to Vijay, because if not for her, we would not have even looked into the ED side of the story, and funding comes from DSPDPP. Thank you. Was the video there? Okay. I think it's... that's the video as we are acquiring the data, and we are going through the cortex layer by layer, and you can see the dendritic arbor coming back. No, I think it's because of the video being played in the laptop. All registered. Professor Vijayalakshmi Ravindra, the chairperson of the Center for Neurosciences at the Institute of Science here. Lots to say about Vijayalakshmi Ravindra, but I'm going to be very, very brief. Vijayalakshmi Ravindra obtained a PhD in Mysore and then went to do a doctoral stint at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. And that's when I know Vijay from 1980 onwards, that we have been very good friends. We have a number of folks. In 1998 or about that, Government of India actually wanted to head the National Brain Research Center, which the Government of India was setting up in Haryana. And she went from Nimans and was the first director. And in 2008, 2009, and Professor Balram, Center for Neurosciences in the division. That's how the CNS has started. Main goal, a unifying goal of the laboratory is to understand mechanisms underlying neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's in particular, that she's going to talk to us about, has been recognized widely. The fellow of the Third World Academy, amongst all of us, she's the only person who highest civilian award of this country. She's on the scientific advisory board of a number of institutes, and I think one here, with her permission, that she's the first woman IIT Council, a member of the IIT Council. So far, the IIT Council has been always a bastion, and here we have Vijay as the first member of this. Yes, there are lots of things. So Vijay is very well recognized, very known for her fabulous work that she has done in this area, and it's a pleasure to invite Vijay to give her talk.
Thank you, Dean. Can we have the lights on? So I'm going to be quickly and make sure it's done. So what I'm about is most of which was carried out after I moved to ISC. We had 12 small rooms. That's how CNS started, with a leaky roof. But I'm very happy to say that even despite that kind of a beginning, we were able to attract a lot of faculty, a lot of money, and I think it's one of the very dynamic departments in ISC now. And so I'm going to talk to you about what we've done here, really about synaptic dysfunction that we have a variety of ways, Alzheimer's disease models. So I skip this slide because Sam and others have talked about it, except the focus has been on both oligomers and transgenic to understand the synaptic pathology, which is one of the main players in Alzheimer's disease. So, is that this is human subject, a 56 patient and a control subject, loss of spines, the new, this is in postmortem brain. And of course, the Selko's group, if you take slices and give a mixture of oligomer at a nanomolar, you see spine loss. And spine loss in the APP that Balaji talked about now, I'm showing the loss in a 12-month-old. The lab was interested in trying to see how early the start. PPPS is you see plaque up at about stage, which is when we also start seeing deficit. And look early on, trying to see how this A-beta in very young animals, just weaned. So if you look at, this is the work done by my graduate student. We looked at total A-beta levels in old, we call adolescent, old, young, and in you see the plaques and the deficits. And what you see is a substantial increase, but this 1 mole milligram protein is about that of control wild-type animals that you see in 9 months. It's not substantially more than the 9-month-old wild-type animals. So the question is, if there is just that bit of increase, will we see any pathology at all? But then Kader, who's been with me for a very long time, who comes to me from, who came with me from MDRC, we started isolating synaptosomes from cortical tissue of these mice, and we started seeing oligomers in the synaptosomes in 1-month mice, and not in the wild-type controls. Of course, the extent of oligomers that you see increases across the age, but you see a substantial amount of oligomers in 1-month-old synaptosomes prepared from 1-month-old animals. At this point, Jyoti joined my laboratory, PhD student. He did his BSc and joined a lab, so he does master's and a PhD degree at IISc. He started asking questions, how much of A-beta 42 accumulates in neurons, primary neurons derived from P0 pups, transgenics. So the red color, the immunostain of A-beta 42 uses antibody specific 42, LV4, and the green represents the caused by the presence of Homer, that's it represents the postsynaptic density. What you see is we have substantial A-beta. Soma, you also see A-beta pump across the neurites. They, of course, went on to actually measure how much of A-beta is present in the soma, so neuron derived from a wild-type mouse, how much of it is in the neurite. And what you see is the substantial amount of A-beta by D15, that is 15 days in vitro, which localizes with the postsynaptic density. So this actually, the data fits in quite well with what Deepak talked about, where a lot of APP co-localizing with the postsynaptic density. Beta is also processed and co-localized in synapse. So at this point, Sunny joined the lab, and Sunny started doing staining in TG animals, again 1 month old, and looking and really did a whole morphome only showing the spine anatomy, because all these posters have been out there for 2 days. But what Sunny was able is that in 1-month-old animals, effective loss of muscle spines, but you don't see similar changes in the other thin spines. So all this data derived by several of my lab show that structural changes occur at the synapse very at 1 month of age when we wean the from the mothers. Although we look at Alzheimer's as an old disease, at least familiar Alzheimer's disease model systems, we see changes very early. So of course, Devjyoti also was able to replicate his observation in vitro in primary cultures of neurons. The cytoskeletal proteins present in the spine, actually actin is one of the major cytoskeletal proteins present in the spine, which gives the spine its shape. So synaptic dysfunction occurs, we emphasized there could be a perturbation of the actin homeostasis because actin actually treadmills fibrillar form, soluble globular form. Treadmilling has been very studied in a number of model systems, though that well in the brain per se. We went and Reddy, who was my former student but came rejoined, and he's a Ramalinga Swami fellow. So started taking synaptosome from these transitions, the cortex again, and separating the synaptosomes into fractions that contain, actually into the postsynaptic, and the fractions contain fibrillar actin and soluble actin, and try to ask the question, what are the changes in fibrillar and globular homeostasis in these animals. See change in these synaptosomes, in the synaptic density, in globular actin. However, at 1 month of showing you the data, actually the lab does 1 month, 3 months. We do a time course. I'm kind of a pharmacology training, although originally a chemist. So what he was that there was quite a substantial loss, actually about 40% of fibrillar actin. I asked the question, why we do not see this actin being presented as an increase in globular actin? Globular actin is present in much higher amount, so a small in or substantial decrease in fibrillar doesn't show in globular. Actually, what Reddy was able to show is that actin decreases in 1 month old synaptoses. At this point, we collaborated with David Bennett. He was not able to join us at this meeting. There's this huge collection of autopsy tissues from MC and AD patients, and he also has the scores and the whole gamut of information about these patients. Received about 12 each of control, MCI and AD, again cortical, and Reddy went ahead and did this is a perturbation of the actin homeostasis in the synapse prepared from the human brain, and sure enough what he sees. Fibrillar actin. In MCI it goes, but you see loss of fibrillar actin in AD brains, chromosomes from AD, and there's no change in globular. I should also say that there's no change in the protein of actin at any of these we've studied. So far about the structure, Reddy is now trying to examine what causes fibrillar actin to depolymerize and becomes globular. Why is this rate of treadmilling, which is this constant homeostasis between globular and fibrillar actin, how is that being perturbed? And looking into the mechanisms, that's what he's trying to do. But at the same time, we started asking the question, if there is so much of structural change that's occurring in 1 month old animals, what are the functional changes that could possibly occur at this time? There have to be, I believe that in the neurodegenerative diseases, the pathogenic process is not like a tunnel that goes through a silo, but it's actually many things take place simultaneously, even if we catch it as early as 1 month in an AD mice. So one of the things that we started thinking about is activity-dependent translation of proteins that occurs at the synapse. This is a very carefully regulated phenomenon and is essential both for synapse maintenance as well as plasticity. And it has actually come, it's in this in the recent years, since we know that about more than 50 mRNAs are actually present in the dendritic spines, are actively translated in the knee and also an activity of the. So for us, who joined my lab as a postdoc, I was also an intern at IISc, but did his PhD from England. So what Faraz did was to prepare synaptoneurosomes, one-month-old cortex of one-month-old animals, and then he went ahead and did an methionine incorporation, the normal condition as well as after a pulse of KCS, and then looks at how much of S35 is actually incorporated into the protein, that's the acid pellets. What we found was activity-dependent translation occurred in the wild. We saw a robust increase in the amount of S35 incorporated in the wild-type synaptosomes, but even in the 1-month-old neurosomes, activity-dependent translation was totally inhibited. I should particularly thank Dean, as I call him, because all the radioactivity experiments were done, and he generously procured all the methionine for me, and allowed me to use his laboratory facilities. We don't have a facility in CMS as yet. Faraz also went on, this was total proteins and how much S35 is incorporated, but he went on and looked at the of ARC, an early protein that translated very early during activity, and showed the increase in ARC expression that we saw in wild type was not seen in the TG animals at 1 month, showing clearly that activity-dependent translation was inhibited in 1-month-old animals. So of course Faraz went on to look in the human autopsy brain that I talked to you about, and in the AD brains we saw that activity-dependent translation was inhibited. In MCI, we did not see that effect. So it stands there. I'm hoping I'll get some sample samples from David and then test the same thing in both MCI and AD. At this point, we started then asking, how does translation take place at the synapse? What's the pathway? So it's a complicated pathway, but enough to say it's a mTOR signaling pathway, very important, which promotes translation. Upstream of mTOR is AKT, which removes inhibitory through phosphorylation, removes the inhibitory effect of CP, thus activating the mTOR pathway. Through a series of experiments done by, I have her picture in the next slide, we found several of this activity of the proteins responsible for protein translation were all suppressed in the 1-month synaptosomes, and I should also mention that all these were specific to the synaptosomes but were not seen when we took nuclear supernatant from the cortex. But upstream we saw a loss of AKT, and not only by Western but also by kinase activity. So it's like AKT could be the key molecule that was inhibiting the mTOR signaling and leading to translation at the synapse. So this is Isha, who was the first graduate student at CMS, and she actually, both the actin work and the AKT, she was the one who initiated and others joined in. Our earlier studies had shown that when AKT is oxidized and the sulfidyl groups are converted to protein-mixed disulfides, AKT has a greater affinity to the phosphatase and gets dephosphorylated. Actually, if you mutate the 2 cysteines in AKT, then it doesn't have the increased affinity and it doesn't get dephosphorylated. So we went ahead and looked at how much of reduced AKT is there in the synaptosomes from these animals, and sure enough, we saw a loss of reduced AKT, and this was associated with an increased affinity to PP2A, showing that that's how AKT was dephosphorylated. And maybe the reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress will evolve. So at this point, Isha went ahead and measured the levels of ROS in synaptosomes, and she saw an increase. And Debjyoti came in, and he used dihydrofluorosine diacetate to label the ROS, and also with Homer, and showed the significant amount of ROS both in the soma and neurites in TG neurons derived from the APPPS1 mice. So this is the good part of being at IISc. You get to collaborate with a number of people. So I saw Mukesh in Nature Communication. Mukesh is right here. He's a professor at the Inorganic and Physical Chemistry department. And Mukesh had developed these nanowires of vanadium oxide, which have the ability to quench hydrogen peroxide to water. But interestingly, they can get while oxidizing glutathione to glutathione disulfide. So it's actually a nanowire that can regenerate itself and quench oxygen radicals. And between Mukesh and Patrick De Silva from biochemistry, they had shown that it was very effective in HEK cells in quenching reactive oxygen species. So what Debjyoti did was to take primary neurons in culture from wild type and TG mice, and on day 5, 7, and 9, he gave a small pulse of these nanowires. Just dropped those nanowires into the medium. They actually diffuse into the neurons. And then he fixed the cells on day 15. So the nanowires had been there for a while. We don't know still the half-life of these nanowires in the neurons. And then again looked at oxidative stress, and he found that this is the marker. This is a dye that gets oxidized and fluoresces. So the red indicates high oxidative stress. You don't see that in the wild type neurons. And when you put the nanowires in, it's gone. And interestingly, he also saw that we could prevent the brain loss if we put the nanowires in. These are very preliminary. Most of what I've told today is unpublished work, but it's very exciting for us now to see that a nanowire of vanadium can actually reverse not only oxidative stress, but some of the structural changes we have seen. There's a lot of work to be done. Ultimately, we have to go in vivo in animals, and I don't know if it will ever translate into humans, but considering that Colin is going to speak after me, I thought I'll leave you with a ray of optimism from our studies. Way back when I was at NBRC, we started a study trying to see if we could use the traditional system of medicine, the Ayurveda, to develop natural therapies for brain disorders. And Dr. Varia, who is now 93, who has a wealth of knowledge, gave me a list of plants and asked me to work on this. He's been trying to convince me for a long time, but ultimately I took up the challenge. And we found, this is Neha Sehgal, who is now a postdoc in Madison. So Neha actually was able to show this extract, when given orally, was completely able to remove the plaque and lower the amyloid burden, not only in middle-aged animals, but also in old animals that were 24 months old. The behavior recovery was complete, and she went on and looked at the mechanism, and what she was able to show is that it's a very interesting way that the plant extract acts. The plant extract increases the expression of a protein called LRP in the liver, a lipoprotein-related protein, and this protein, a part of it is cleaved and thrown into the plasma as SLRP, and this acts as a sink drawing A-beta out. In a series of very rigorous experiments, Neha was able to show that if we block the expression of LRP in the liver, we were able to completely block the therapeutic activity of the plant extract. What was very interesting was that the extract acted through the liver by increasing the peripheral zinc and did not act directly on the brain. This extract is from the thymus that Julian talked about. Julian has been familiar with this for a while now, and this actually what also made us happy was this pathway reinforces the concept of traditional system of medicine, where they believe in holistic approach to it, and they believe that maintaining a healthy body is necessary for having a healthy mind. So Warrior was very, very happy. Of course, this extract had about 100 compounds, and now Aarti has started working on the purified fractions, and we do have a couple of fractions that are showing promise. It's been a little slow because I also moved at this time, but we hope that we will be able to get a more well-defined set of, I don't believe it's going to be a single compound. I personally think it's going to be a mixture of compounds, maybe synergistic, and it's not RNA, that's for sure. But we hope that we'll be able to get to the active molecules and take it forward in translation. So I'm far ahead of time, isn't it, Dian?
Yeah.
But that's okay, we'll make up and we'll have enough time before. That's what I wanted to do. So I want to thank my collaborators, Mukesh and Patrick, whom I mentioned, David Bennett, Subhash from Delhi University, he's the professor of chemistry. He's the one who fractionates the extracts for us. Suman Thakur from CCMB, who helps me with the mass spec. Edith Hamel from Montreal Neurological Institute. Edith actually validated this extract independently in Montreal in another model of Alzheimer's mice, the Swedish Indiana mutation. Deepak and Balaji have been helping me a lot as my students in getting their microscopy skills up and running. And this is NBRC that you saw yesterday. And of course the funding came through grant, a center grant that we got from the Department of Science and Technology as soon as the Center for Neuroscience started. That's what helped us buy all the fancy microscopes in the beginning. And of course the faculty then got grants and bought more. And now more recently, we have another big program grant on Alzheimer's disease that brings together the faculty of CMS as well as clinicians from NIMHANS, Rangarajan from mathematics, a whole bunch of people to work on early Alzheimer's disease from molecules to behavior at different levels. It's fun because we learn from each other, and it's an experiment in a way because we have never done this kind of thing before, with 14 investigators coming together to work on a single project. Thank you very much.
The end result in terms of understanding the impact or the action will be multi-component. Does this tell us something about trying to seek a monomolecular solution for those diseases and the need for multi-molecular approaches?
So yesterday Covid was asking the question, why can't we combine? I personally think, considering that we are still not able to diagnose diseases as early as we would like to, we will probably end up having complicated but at least in the familial cases where they know they have the mutation, if we could approach very early, start treating very early, maybe we could start with
In the plant extract, the mechanism, do you think it's possible that other mechanisms also may contribute to?
So, the only reason I say this is when we gave the antisense RNA, I didn't describe the experiment, when we gave the antisense RNA to LRT and we gave it IP so that it went to the liver and not the brain, and we found that amyloid removal from the brain was stopped. In fact, the build-up started and plasma amyloid actually decreased. It's, you would, I think, as the amyloid burden decreases in the initial stages, maybe other mechanisms act. Because we did see inflammation going down. We saw all of that happening too with the extract. Whether they are a consequence of the amyloid burden or not, we don't know as yet. But definitely, the first week, the only effect we saw was activity. We did microRNA, we did all those things, a lot of things didn't get published, but we didn't see anything.
Alcoholic extract, what you have used, madam, actually, whole extracts.
So it was a semi-purified extract, it was
Because-
not an active.
Oh, is it? Because
It was not
lipophilic,
a hydrophilic, it's a lipophilic extract.
oh, because in Ayurveda, because basically I'm an Ayurvedic doctor, because the thing is the method of extraction in Ayurveda also, it has got its own different processes. Therefore, that's why.
So I should tell you this. Maria made me a concoction of several herbs that he thought will reverse, and he gave it to me in a preparation of clarified butter.
Yeah.
I gave it. That became our negative control.
So it is single medicine plant. Ayurveda only.
Yeah, I mean, I figured he's a knowledge base in this
Yes.
system of medicine. He prepared it and he prepared it in heat and gave it, and we treated it the same way. We didn't get, we got the behavior, thought,
Any specific target is there, madam? Any of the Vitania somnifera, specifically what you had told, many of the alcohol somniferins, is there any specific entity you want to?
Vithanolides and bifenosides.
Vithanolide.
90% vithanolides and bifenosides. No other.
Any characterization and other things has been?
Yeah, the master is the name for the extract.
No, thank you very much.